Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
China and Argentina renewed a currency swap agreement. China's foreign trade expanded over 19% last month, and Saudi Arabia, Turkiye and Pakistan signed a joint defense agreement. Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Do Hongyu in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our first story. China's central bank says it's renewed a bilateral currency swap agreement with the Central Bank of Argentina. The swap amount is set at 130 billion yuan, around $19.1 billion, equivalent to 28 trillion Argentine pesos. The agreement runs for 5 years and is renewable by mutual consent. The People's Bank of China says the move will help deepen financial cooperation between the two countries, facilitate bilateral economic and trade exchanges, and safeguard financial market stability. For more, we're joined by Professor Liu Baochang, Director of the Center for International Business Ethics and the University of International Business and Economics. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. Argentina's President Javier Milei once made harsh anti-China remarks during his campaign, but his government just renewed the bilateral currency swap agreement with China for the longest 5-year term since 2009. What pressures forced this dramatic U-turn?
I think it's not really surprising for politicians to change position from election period into a governing period because they normally fantasize their constituencies with some sort of idealized position, but now when they really come to the office, they must confront the economic constraints. That's the first and prioritized consideration of their people, and so therefore he has to answer the practical needs for the country to manage out of the difficulties. So Argentina has faced very long challenges, including currency depreciation, the cash drain in their foreign exchange reserve, inflation pressure, and more pressingly, it's really the external liquidity issue. So under such circumstances, the currency swap with China provides the most valuable financial buffer and help Argentina to manage the short-term pressure in the foreign exchange marketplace. China is also showing its very strong goodwill alongside its intention to further engage in economic cooperation with Argentina. So this helps them to alleviate the financial burden pressurized by many other global financial institutions. So any government seeking economic recovery, they must take the reality into serious consideration. So in the end, this is not simply a political U-turn, but it's really recognition of international economic relations. And also by working with China, they have really benefit a great deal, and they feel the sincerity and also good intention from the China side.
Washington had tried to persuade Argentina to abandon the swap arrangement. So what were the U.S. purposes in doing so, and why did it fail to stop the renewal?
The hegemonistic ideology within certain groups of the United States in power, they always maintain a broader strategic concern with regard to China's growing economic presence and also political influence in Latin American countries. So Washington has traditionally viewed Latin America as an area of strategic importance. So they have increasingly they exert certain pressure out of their own interest and out of their own ideological pursuit to curtail the expansion of some countries like China to expand its role in trade, infrastructure, finance, and technology. So from the U.S. perspective, reducing dependence on the Chinese financial arrangement would limit China's influence in that region and strengthen the power of Washington in that region. However, Argentina's decision, they really reflect the reality that continue to make their foreign policies based on their own economic interest and also their sovereign integrity. So the question for Argentina is not really to choose sides, but rather to solve the most pressing and urgent problem to prevent the economic fallout.
Then, how does Argentina's defiance of U.S. pressure and its renewal of the China deal affect U.S. strategic credibility and influence in Latin America?
I think for the US, they have to view the competing position between United States and China and just some other countries. So this episode highlights a broader trend in Latin America. On the other hand, the strategic autonomy is becoming increasingly important instead of simply following the directions of the United States without gaining the materialized benefits. So even government like Argentina that maintain very close political and security ties with Washington, they also have to answer the practical needs of their own people and getting resolved in their economic development. So that really requires a very much diversified partnership with countries that have the economic power. Argentina can really maintain strong relations with the United States, but that does not really prevent them to make their own independent decision to continue cooperating with China because of the relationship. They really serve very different purposes. So for Washington, okay, come up with something that demonstrates certain competitive advantage. Without it, political rhetorics and pressure won't really help them to solve the problem, even to worsen the problem they have to face. So the lesson is that a long-term influence comes not only from geopolitical preference, but also from the ability to be able to contribute to their economic growth, infrastructure development, and technological progress, but immediately the financial stability of Argentina.
Now, as the first Latin American country to sign a currency swap with China, Argentina has maintained continuous financial cooperation through multiple political shifts. So, what does this stable institutional partnership reveal about China's economic ties with Latin America beyond partisan ideology?
It is true. Over the years, Argentina has experienced the turbulent changes with their political transitions, with governments holding very different ideological positions. Yet, the economic ties with China have contributed to their domestic stability and continue to serve as a very strong stabilizer based on the concrete interest in terms of the economic growth, in terms of trade, in terms of the putting a cap on their inflation drive. So very practically, the political constituencies, they do see the infrastructure cooperation with China and also in the area of agriculture, energy, and finance does lend very practical benefit to their people in terms of the job opportunities, in terms of the cashing on their resources. So this suggests that China engagement with Latin America is not simply a matter of dependence, but a matter of mutual cooperation and also mutual benefit. So Latin American economies, they have many natural resources, and they also have a strong need for infrastructure development in which China provides such a competitive advantage that any politicians with the right mind, with the right type of responsibility towards their own people would not really ignore that.
Now, beyond bilateral trade facilitation and financial stability, what role does this upgraded long-term currency swap play in advancing RMB internationalization within the Latin American market?
On the China side, we also make very rational calculations instead of a sort of blunt-folded investment merely out of goodwill. Latin America has really improved quite a great deal in terms of their inflation control, in terms of the external liquidity, And so therefore their credit rating within the global financial institutions has also seen a improvement. And with that, China's currency arrangement on a renewed basis is there to help, of course, the economic activities between the bilateral relationship, and that also helps the Latin American countries with a showcase to use RMB in certain transactions, can provide additional options, and that can reduce the dependence on a single international currency and on a single international the financial institution. So the broader RMB usage can really support a deeper financial connectivity with major trading partners and facilitate, more importantly, the resilience of supply chain between not only these two countries, but also between China versus a broader part of a Latin American region. So that's something, a strategic consideration, and also can deliver strategic and long-term benefit for both sides.
And finally, Professor, what potential political and economic risks might Argentina face in balancing its pro-US diplomatic stance and pragmatic financial cooperation with China in the years to come?
There are several fronts. They have to manage their relationship with a diversified, globalized world. So politically, Argentina may face pressure from different sides, particularly from the United States in terms of the choosing sides on a political front, but closer cooperation with China can really create a benefit for their own people, while they are also concerned over their own domestic political groups, which may have different views over such sort of cooperation. Economically, Argentina must ensure that their external financing and trade relationship can really offer a stronger support for their long-term development rather than simply addressing the short-term financial pressures. And the most sustainable approach for Argentina is not really to choose between China and the United States, either on a political or economic level, but rather to maintain a diversified international partnership, and together also with global financial institutions based on their own national interest calculation.
Thank you very much. That was Professor Liu Baocheng at the University of International Business and Economics. This is World Today. Stay tuned. China's foreign trade in goods rose over 17% in the first 7 months of 2026, accelerating from the January to June pace. Trade with ASEAN rose 20%, while trade with Belt and Road partners increased 15.5%. China-EU trade was up 9.5%. In July alone, China's total imports and exports reached over 4.6 trillion yuan, or about $690 billion, a 19.2% increase. Industrial robots and 3D printer exports surged over 50% during the month, accounting for nearly 60% of the exports growth. Meanwhile, China's consumer price index rose 0.5% in July. For more, Zhao Yang spoke with Li Lun, an assistant professor of economics at Peking University.
Professor Li Lun, thank you very much for joining us. China's foreign trade grew by more than 17% in the first 7 months of this year, with imports growing even faster than exports. So what are main forces behind the strong performance?
Yeah, so I think firstly, we're seeing a unusually broad-based, geographically representative growth. So we're talking about a total goods trade, which has reached over 30 trillion yuan for the first 7 months, and it's up by 17.3%, as you mentioned. But if we look at trade with each region, so trade with ASEAN countries have grew by 20%, with EU by 9.5%, with Belt and Road partners 15.5%, and with Latin America 15.4%. With Africa, 18.9%, so on and so forth. So we're seeing a diversification, which is really going to matter because it's reducing China's dependence on any single export market and is representing China's resilience in its export market. And secondly, I think this number is representing a a technological shift or technological cycle behind the numbers. So, for example, if we focus on the mechanical and electrical products, it has the exports has increased by more than 20% and is also accounting for 60% of China's exports. So, a lot of these high-tech exports are growing rapidly, and it's taking more and more share of China's total export. And if we look closely into China's export market, especially for EV, for example, the EV exports were up by 70% in the first 7 months. The lithium batteries are over 35%. Wind turbines, 3D printers, they have behaved very well. So I think this technological intensive manufactured products are really driving up the export numbers as well. And I think finally, the import side itself, as you mentioned, is also supporting the trade growth. So the imports have increased by over 22% and is actually more than the export growth. So I would describe this combination as both the market diversification and also product upgrading. So China is selling to a wider range of countries, but also, what China is selling is fundamentally changing.
And as you mentioned, China's exports of EVs and lithium batteries continue to grow strongly, while the 3D printers and industrial robots are also seeing rapid growth. So are these products becoming the next major engine of China's export growth?
Yeah, so I think these products are becoming a representation of the cluster of new products themselves. So I don't think they are the only growth drivers. They are representing the entire upgrading of an entire industry. For example, an EV is a final product, but it also have the different car components, softwares, AI driving system, and also the car seats, so on and so forth. So the consumer export is also representing the production capacity that's behind it. So the similar logic goes to robots, 3D printers, chips. So China is not just exporting the goods, they're also exporting technologies, and also they're allowing firms in other markets and other countries to use these technologies and produce more efficiently. So I think this is representing a more fundamental and significant change in our competitive advantage. So instead of just exporting the products, we are using the high-tech innovation to kind of reshape the export in a lot of different dimensions. So in terms of the technological content, in terms of the value added, in terms of not only exporting the final goods or finished manufactured goods, we're also exporting equipments, components, and technological capacities. So this is representing a whole different level of change for Chinese foreign trade market.
Well, China's chip exports are rising despite continued U.S. restrictions on advanced semiconductor technology. So what does this tell us about the resilience of China's semiconductor industry?
Yeah, so we're seeing a quite extraordinary change in China's value added especially for integrated circuit exports. So the export has reached about $216 billion from January to July, which is almost 100% year-on-year increase. So China is basically behaving this remarkable resilience despite of U.S. control and U.S. restrictions. So I think the export number is suggesting that China has expanded its production and exports in some areas that's firstly less directly constrained by the U.S. And also China is simultaneously investing heavily in a lot of domestic substitutes for the technologies affected by these U.S. controls. And in terms of global demand is also very important. So the AI-related demand has been a major driver for China's 2026 exports. The semiconductor shipments are particularly affected by this trend. So I think overall, this increase in China's semiconductor industry and the remarkable behavior in the export numbers are showing both we are having a self-sufficient or resilient supply side, but also it's driven by this quite potentially growing and fastly growing demand side, especially in terms of the foreign demand as well.
And another notable shift is that the imports now growing faster than exports. So what does this tell us?
Yeah, so the imports have risen by 22% from January to July, compared with 14% of export growth. So I think this is quite important because it's suggesting that China's trade performance this year is not simply on one side of the scale. Rather, we're both exporting more and also importing more. But I don't think this is all about the consumer demand. So I think it's pointing a strong evidence towards an industrial and investment related demand. So, for example, the imports of mechanical and electrical products rose almost 30% for the first 7 months, and the commodity values of these imports are also increasing. So I think the composition is telling us that the imports are rising strongly, but a lot of these acceleration and additional imports are coming from components, equipment, and materials, especially in terms of intermediate goods, rather than simply from household demand. So I think this effect has, by China's opening up, China has continuing to reduce the barriers to imports, and also some of the zero tariff treatments to a growing number of trading partners have increased imports despite of the for example, the geopolitical tensions and also the business cycle. So overall, I think the faster import growth is certainly a positive sign for both the domestic demand, but I think the stronger sign is that the industrial upgrading, the industrial demand is also taken up. And I think it's telling us a very interesting transition of China's manufacturing and technological sector.
And we've also seen the foreign invested enterprises are performing quite well in foreign trade growth. So does this signal the confidence from multinational corporations here in China?
Yes, definitely. I think this is a very meaningful sign that the foreign invested enterprises have actually recorded a higher trade growth than the overall increase in China's trade. So I think this is a consistent evidence that the foreign funded companies, they're actually enjoying or benefiting from China's very active foreign trade market, and a lot of foreign funded companies have made additional investment in China. So I think this is very interesting that the investment is also going into high-tech industries. So the FDI into, for example, these high-tech industries have increased by 33.2% and is accounting for over 40% of total inflows. So the multinational companies, they're also viewing China not just as a low-cost production base, but rather as part of their technological R&D and advanced manufacturing strategy hub. So at the same time, I think we should also distinguish between the trade performance and investment confidence. But I do think that in the future, multinationals should really treat China as both as a big market, but also a big hub for innovation. And I think this is going to create even more sophistication in the supply chain and also build an even better innovation system.
And meanwhile, China's CPI rose by 0.5% in July, while PPI rose 3.5%. So how do you explain these numbers? And what does it tell us about the current state of consumer demand and economic recovery?
Yeah, so I think PPI has moved very decisively into the positive territory after years of reduction or showing the weakness, and I think this is actually a very positive news. So if we start with CPI, actually CPI have slowed slightly from the 1.0% in June to 0.5% in July, and largely I think this has been caused by the reduction of gasoline price inflation. And if we look at food prices or the core CPIs, they're actually remain stable. So I think the consumer prices have largely remained very resilient. It's not showing any significant changes in the product prices or the service prices for consumers. In the first half of 2026, China's total retail sales have grown by 2.7%, but service retail sales have increased by 5.3%. So this is actually growing faster than total retail. So I think the fastest growing categories also include tourism, recreation, a lot of other experience-based consumption. So in the future, I think services like this, also including online services, software and information technology services, it's also going to provide a lot of growth potential for the economy.
That was Li Luan with Peking University. You're listening to World Today. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. We'll be back after a short break.
Hello, my name is Alessandro Golombiewski Teixeira. I'm a professor of public policy and management at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I am a great listener of The World Today. In my opinion, The World Today is one of the best China radio programs. In The World Today, we can get the best news and analysis in what is happening now in the world. So please come to join us.
You're listening to World Today with me, Do Hongyu, in Beijing. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan have signed a joint defense agreement stipulating that any armed attack against one of the three countries will be considered an attack against them all. The agreement was signed during a summit for joint defense held in the Saudi city of Mecca. A joint statement says the agreement reflects the three countries' commitment to strengthening their collective security and safeguarding regional peace and stability. It also says the agreement seeks to bolster collective deterrence against any act of aggression and deepen defense cooperation across all sectors. Now, for more, we're joined by Sultan Hali, a retired Air Force officer and author in Pakistan. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Hali.
You're welcome.
First of all, how should we understand the strategic motivations of the three countries behind forming this new security arrangement?
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show and asking me to comment on this very, very current and important topic. Please remember that the foremost motivation behind this particular pact is the recognition that the three states, they face overlapping security challenges, ranging from regional instability in the Middle East to evolving threats in South Asia. Thus, by pooling their defense resources, they seek to create a credible deterrent against external aggression and non-state actors. This pact signals a shift from fragmental bilateral ties to a consolidated trilateral security architecture. Each country in the past has historically relied on Western defense partnerships. The agreement reflects a desire to reduce overdependence on external powers and instead build indigenous, Muslim world-led security arrangements. It is about asserting strategic autonomy while balancing relations with global powers. And defense cooperation, by the way, is not limited to military exercises. It extends to joint production, technology transfer, and industrial collaboration. Pakistan brings battlefield experience and a tested defense industry. Turkey contributes advanced drone and aerospace technology, while Saudi Arabia offers financial muscle and strategic geography. Together, they aim to create a sustainable ecosystem for defense innovation. The pact, thus, is a message to the wider international community that Muslim states can unite to safeguard their interests, and it strengthens their collective bargaining power in global forums and signals that they are capable of shaping regional security dynamics rather than being passive recipients of external strategies. Signed in Mecca, the holiest of places for Muslims, the agreement carries symbolic weight. It underscores the role of shared faith and cultural identity in forging their unity. And beyond military calculus, it is about projecting Muslim solidarity at a time when divisions have often weakened collective influence.
The agreement emphasizes collective deterrence and regional stability. What potential security challenges or threats might this new framework be designed to address?
Well, you see, the pact is designed to counter destabilizing conflicts in the Middle East and South Asia. And the ongoing proxy wars, the sectarian militancy, and external interventions have repeatedly undermined stability. Collective deterrence signals that aggression against one will be met with a united response. Now, the groups that are operating across porous borders, whether in Afghanistan, Syria, or Yemen, they pose asymmetric threats. Pakistan brings hard-won counter-terrorism experience Turkey contributes NATO standard operational capacity, and Saudi Arabia offers strategic depth. Together, they aim to deny safe havens and coordinate intelligence. The Red Sea, Arabian Sea, and Eastern Mediterranean are critical arteries for global energy supplies. Therefore, threats from piracy, Houthi attacks on shipping, or potential blockades, they jeopardize economic lifelines. And the pact strengthens naval cooperation to secure that the sea lines remain open and protect energy infrastructure. The three states are conscious of being targeted by external powers, military deployments, and sanction regimes. Collective deterrence is a hedge against coercion, ensuring that no single state can be isolated or pressured without the others stepping in. Beyond conventional threats, the framework anticipates cyber warfare, drone swarms, and missile proliferation. Joint R&D and shared defense industries will help them prepare for the next generation challenges.
Yemen's Houthi group has attacked a Saudi refinery 2 days after the defense pact was signed. So, how would you characterize this attack in light of the defense pact? And does it trigger the collective defense provisions?
Well, that's a good observation. The strike on a Saudi refinery by Yemen's Houthi group is emblematic of asymmetric warfare. Non-state actors targeting critical infrastructure to project power and destabilize the region. It underscores precisely the kind of threat that the pact was designed to address. Now, while the pact emphasizes collective deterrence, it is not a mechanical trigger like NATO's Article 5. Instead, it provides a framework for consultation, intelligence sharing, and a coordinated response. This attack, which you just mentioned, it highlights the urgency of operationalizing these mechanisms, joint air defense, counter-drone systems, and maritime security patrols. The attack is a test of credibility if the three states demonstrate unity through joint condemnation, enhanced defense readiness, and visible cooperation. It will send a deterrent signal to both state and non-state adversaries that aggression will not divide them.
Pakistan has been an active mediator between the US and Iran. What are the dilemmas it faces from this dual role?
Pakistan's mediation between the US and Iran, it places it in a delicate position. On one hand, it seeks to reduce tensions in the Gulf. On the other, it is now part of a defense pact that could be perceived as aligned against Iranian proxies. Pakistan must ensure that its role in the pact does not erode its neutrality in dialogue with Tehran. Pakistan's public opinion values independence from great power blocs, so overt alignment against Iran could be politically sensitive. Pakistan must avoid being drawn into direct confrontation, lest its mediation role be compromised. If managed wisely, Pakistan can leverage its dual role, using the pact to strengthen deterrence while simultaneously offering diplomatic off ramps to Iran. This duality, hard power through alliance, soft power through mediation, could enhance Pakistan's stature as both a security partner and a peace broker.
Now, Turkey says the agreement is technically the same as NATO's Article 5 mutual defense agreement. So, how could this pact affect the existing security architecture in the Middle East, particularly amid ongoing tensions and conflicts in the region?
You must note that Turkey's comparison to Article 5 is deliberate. It conveys that an attack on one member will be treated as an attack on all. Now, while the pact may not yet have the institutional depth of NATO, the symbolism is powerful. It signals a collective security guarantee within the Muslim world, which is likely to actually attract other Muslim states and maybe other non-Muslim states also who have the same, train of thought to join this particular pact. So traditionally, Middle Eastern security has been shaped by bilateral defense ties with external powers. This pact introduces a trilateral, indigenous framework that could gradually reduce reliance on Western military umbrellas. It creates a counterweight to existing blocs, whether the US-led coalitions in the Gulf or Russian-Iranian alignments in Syria. The pact asserts that regional states can craft their own security architecture. By including Pakistan, the pact bridges South Asia with the Middle East, expanding the geographic scope of collective deterrence. The pact may be perceived by Tehran as a challenge, especially given its support for groups like the Houthis. Now, this could complicate diplomacy, but it would also incentivize Iran to engage in dialogue rather than escalation. In Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, the pact could deter further attacks on critical infrastructure and embolden joint responses to non-state actors. With Saudi Arabia's oil facilities under threat, collective defense enhances protection of global energy supplies, a stabilizing factor for international markets. Therefore, this pact is embryonic, but could evolve into a cornerstone of Middle Eastern security, and if institutionalized through joint command structures, regular exercises, and defense industry integration, it may redefine the balance of power in the region.
Thank you very much. That was Sultan Ali, a retired Air Force officer and author in Pakistan. Coming up, the U.S. to invest $3 billion in minerals projects. This is World Today. We'll be back. U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a $3 billion investment covering critical minerals projects to increase domestic production. Trump said the U.S. was reclaiming its position as a global leader in minerals, stressing that critical minerals are vital to industries ranging from advanced weapons and electric vehicles to clean energy technologies. The move comes as countries around the world seek greater control over strategic mineral resources. Last week, the Democratic Republic of the Congo banned exports of copper and cobalt concentrate as it pushes to expand domestic processing and capture more value from its mineral wealth. Now, for more, we're joined by Warwick Powell, adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor.
It's good to be with you.
Could you please help us understand why critical minerals have become a strategic priority for major economies and what makes them so important for industries, especially defense?
Strategic minerals and rare earth elements are critical inputs into a broad range of technologies and components that are necessary for modern electronics, as well as modern defense systems. The American defense system, for example, is heavily dependent upon a broad range of rare earth elements and critical minerals, most of which are sourced from China, without which critical elements of the American defense architecture, ranging from F-35 fighter jets through to many of its sophisticated radar-enabled targeting missiles, would simply not be possible. So from an American point of view, as their arsenal has been progressively depleted over the last few years, and in more pronounced ways in the last 4 months after its attack on Iran, the United States has now reached a point where it needs to desperately replenish its inventory, and yet it doesn't have access to many of the critical materials that it actually needs. We've seen, for example, that it has shipped some F-35 fighter jets without the relevant radar equipment installed simply because the United States manufacturing system did not have available and does not yet have available the magnets necessary for these technologies. So you can see why it's absolutely critical for the United States from a military industrial complex development point of view to have access to these raw materials.
And then what do you think are the purposes of the Trump administration's investment on critical minerals projects now?
The critical objective is to reduce dependency and risk exposure to supply chains that the United States does not control, and in particular, the supply chains that are controlled by China, from the exploration and mining of rare earths all the way through ultimately to processing and refinement and production into final products. This is a complex supply chain that the United States, over the course of the last half century, progressively abandoned and in the process outsourced much of the supply chain activities to other parts of the world, including to companies in China. So China has developed a level of expertise in downstream processing of rare earth elements that now positions Chinese companies at the global cutting edge, delivering levels of quality that and refinement that are unmatched anywhere in the world and which are in fact necessary for many of the most advanced applications. So the United States is seeking to compensate for the last 50 years of industrial hollowing out, and it hopes to do that by injecting substantial federal government funds into the sector.
And then what has driven the Democratic Republic of the Congo to promote domestic processing of critical minerals?
Well, the main one is cobalt. Cobalt, the DRC controls around 70 to 75% of global supplies of cobalt and some 50-odd% of known global reserves. So it is the dominant supplier of raw materials. And unsurprisingly, given its position within the supply chain system, it is now seeking to increase value adding in the DRC so as to increase income generation and employment opportunities, obviously for its own people, and to develop a more complex and sophisticated economy for broader development purposes. In other words, the DRC is seeking to leverage its control over a large supply base to enhance its overall economic position in global value chain networks and shift its position from being simply a producer of raw commodities to being a supplier of high-value, value-added products.
Congo is the world's largest cobalt producer. Then how could its ban on the exports of cobalt affect global supply and prices?
Well, I think it will, of course, lead to some tightening up of supply. And as supply tightens up, we can expect some increase in prices, which will progressively percolate through global supply chain networks. What's more important to understand is not simply that we are talking about a disruption to supply leading to price increases. We're looking at a fundamental restructuring over time of the distribution of value adding globally. And where the DRC is trying to get to is to increase the amount of value adding that takes place inside the DRC. So we're not just looking at a regulatory imposed constraint on supply of raw materials per se. We're looking at a restructuring of global cobalt value adding.
Now, some people argue that building new mining and processing capacity can take years. So what obstacles will countries face in developing alternative supply chains?
Well, significant obstacles. Mining is costly and difficult activity. First, you have to identify the location of resources. You then have to develop mining plans to be able to extract those resources. In many cases, the location of resources is a long way away from relevant transportation capabilities. And of course, to mine many of these resources, you've got to build infrastructure to get equipment there and to power equipment, whether it's electricity or building roads or rail networks. So pulling off major mine developments is a substantial undertaking. It's not something that we can do with a click of the finger. And one of the challenges you've got, I'll make this point about the United States in particular, is that the United States can throw a lot of money into these things. There's no shortage of money. The challenge it has is, amongst other things, a shortage of skilled labour, for example. The Society for Mining, Metallurgy and Exploration projects that about 50%, a little bit more than 50% of the American mining workforce, about 220,000 workers, will need to be replaced shortly due to retirement. Okay, the average age of US miners is 46 years old. So this is a very significant aging workforce that is going to create a big skill shortage problem for American mining. That's going to be arguably its most significant constraint going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. That was Warwick Powell, adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. This is World Today. Stay tuned. Syria is set to take back control of 2 key military bases from Russia. On Sunday, Syria announced a new deal with Moscow on the future of the 2 bases. Under the agreement, Damascus will take over the Hmeimim air base and the commercial berth at Tartus port. The military facilities will be turned into joining training centers. The Syrian interim government will run the civilian part of the facilities. Syria's foreign ministry says the new arrangement represents a reorganizing of the Russian presence along the country's coast. Now, for more, joining us in the studio is my colleague Gao Yingshi. Thank you for joining us, Yingshi.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, what do these 2 bases mean for Russia? And why does Syria want to take them back?
Well, first, for Russia, these 2 bases are really important. Tartus and Hmeimim are Russia's only 2 official military bases outside the former Soviet Union. Tartus, with Russia's presence dates back to the Soviet era, is Moscow's only naval facilities in the Mediterranean. It is a key warm water port that sustains Russia's presence in the Mediterranean and supports its logistics toward the Middle East and also Africa. Hmeimim base has an airfield and can provide air support. And after the transition of the Syrian government, Russian military assets spread across Syria is now concentrated in these 2 locations. It contains political symbolic meaning, so prove that Russia still keep a sort of influence inside Syria. But for Syria, the motivation is definitely equally clear. And I would like to highlight 3 layers. First is the sovereignty. The agreement itself is a message that the central government control all these assets in Syria territory, and that kind of a national sovereignty is not up for negotiation. And the second is the economy. The civilian facilities like warehouse at Tartus port and the airport attached to the Hmeimim base, they are valuable assets that can generate revenue for Syrian government. It's like more important when considering the fact that Syria is actually facing huge reconstruction burdens. And definitely the third layer is the politics. These bases were instruments that can date back to Assad's time. So reclaiming these facilities carries enormous symbolic weight for the new government's legitimacy. It is also noteworthy that the fact is Syria is not choose to just expel Russian forces. It is reclaiming ownership and control while allowing Russian military presence. That kind of a middle ground tells us a lot about the pragmatism of the new leadership.
Then when were these bases established, and what does the agreement tell us about the relationship between Damascus and Moscow right now?
Okay, that's a little bit history background here. So the Tartus naval bases is the older one of the 2. It can date back to the Soviet era, to the 1971 agreement, and served as the support base during the Cold War period. The Hmeimim air base is much newer. It's established in 2015 agreement at the height of civil war. So both bases were formalized under the long-term agreement signed with the former government. And also, notably, that the President al-Shara has publicly committed to honoring this kind of agreements. And after the transition of the Syrian government, the new leadership chose, as I said, a relatively more pragmatic approach. It chose engagement rather than just confrontation with Russia. Al-Shara visited Moscow actually twice in 2025 and this year. And it also has publicly committed that the new government would honor the agreements signed by by its predecessors. That is what really stabilized this bilateral relationship during the transition period. And after roughly like 18 months of negotiations, the two sides reached this kind of a memorandum of understanding, converting these two military bases into kind of joint training centers and handling those civilian facilities within the bases over to the Damascus within the 3 months. So Russia's foreign minister had already hinted last year that bases might be kind of repurposed. So it's not a surprise for both sides. So in terms of how to characterize this relationship right now, it actually has become more transactional. Okay, Moscow accepted a reduced footprint in order to preserve ties and avoid total exclusion, while Damascus gained sovereignty without making an enemy. So in short, the bilateral relationship now looks more like currently limited, but also managed partnership.
Then that brings us to an important question here. Why would Syria's new leadership choose to keep a good relationship with Russia? And what does Moscow gain by giving up full control but holding on to a foothold?
So these are actually two questions. So let me take each side in turn. So first is Damascus side. So why does Damascus keep Russia close? First, Russia remains a permanent member of the UN Security Council with a veto and this kind of key influence over the Syria's file. There is like simply no benefit in just making a new enemy. Second, like the legacy of independence. Syria's armed forces before was like heavily built. It's basically built on Russian equipment and way of training, and this kind of doctrine and also like military ties just cannot be entangled overnight. And third, the credibility problem. So by honoring those kind of past agreements, the new government signals that to all these potential partners, including no matter Western or the Gulf region states, that Syria is a state that respects commitments, that reputation is worth a great deal when you are asking the world for investments and also like reconstruction aid. And also definitely false is the diversification of relationship. So keep Russia as one key partner among several. It prevents over-dependence on any single external power. So now to the Moscow side, it's better to accept. For Moscow, it's better to accept the status quo instead of just like being excluded. These are Russia's only Mediterranean bases. Losing them entirely would be end decades of strategic positioning. Kind of a negotiated reduction keeps a legal and also like internationally recognized presence, and also keeps the door open for the relationship to grow again after Syria again get more stabilized. It also reduces cost when Russia's military resources are heavily being deployed in Ukraine. There is kind of a reputational dimension also. So Moscow wants to show other partners in the region that it is adaptive and pragmatic, not being like trapped to old causes.
Thank you very much. That was my colleague Gao Yingshi. And that's all the time for this edition of World Today. A quick recap of today's headlines. China and Argentina have renewed a currency swap agreement. China's foreign trade expanded over 19% last month. And Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan have signed a joint defense agreement. I'm Do Hongyu in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.